Hi. Ooh, jiggly camera. Hi, welcome to episode 12. Moron Clefs, or moron Clefs. You be the judge. Yeah, there's more to say about Clefs. God, I never thought I had to do 2 videos on Clefs. I bet I could do 5. But I just wanted to go through all the Clefs and talk about them a little more and let you hear more about them. I'm right above a piano here. Hear it? That's a piano. And let's start with the C clef. Going back in time, we'll start with the C clef. And you might remember I talked about how a C clef used to look kind of like this, or like kind of like 2 neumes joined by a line. I can't draw it very well. And it could move around. Like I said, it can be over any line. They never wrote it on a space, I think because it's kind of confusing. It's hard to tell. So there's never a C clef that's on a space. It's always telling you a line is C. And it's always telling you a middle line is C. And like I said, through some weird way of, through some weird history, it ended up looking more like this, where there's 2 lines and then this like hump thing. It's a little fancier than that if you look at an actual notation, like a notation program or printed music. You'll see mine is a little bare bones, but for some reason that's our C clef now. Obviously, if most people look at that, it looks a lot more like a B. I guess the C is like squished together when rogue, or maybe it's 2 C's up that are both backwards. Why that's now what we call a C, but it is, and this is in fact the most common C clef that is still in use regularly. This is the alto clef. And the alto clef today is oftentimes called the viola clef. The alto clef is a clef that violists use, and no one else just automatically reads an alto clef. Every once in a while, some other instruments will for a little bit get into alto clef, but it's pretty much just the province of the viola. And let's just go ahead and start with alto clef, with the thing I want to do today, which is visit our lovely, very favorite song and write it out how it would be, or see what would happen if we changed clefs on it. You'll see what I mean. So if I'm going to write this out in notes, I'm going to write it out all in quarter notes. And it's going to look like that. Now, that sounds like this. Because we have middle C, the bottom note, and then it starts on an E. And this one in between them is a D. So E, D, C, D, E, E, E. What if we kept this the exact same way written out, but I'm going to write it over here. You'll see why in a little. I'm going to write it on the same lines. Okay, there's our Mary Had a Little Lamb. And like I said, if we stuck an alto clef in front of there, it would sound like this. What if we stuck a treble clef in front of there and left those lines exactly how they are? If we stuck a treble clef in front of there, now all of a sudden this sounds like this. So, for one thing, it doesn't sound like Mary Had a Little Lamb anymore because of, well, half and whole steps, something we haven't really talked about, but higher, right? What if we put it, not this clef, but a bass clef in front of it? Well, now all of a sudden it's going to sound like this. Ooh, that's kind of a creepy Mary Had a Little Lamb. Right? So the same notes that someone wrote on the staff, if you put a different clef in there, they're not only going to change their pitch, but oftentimes going to change the whole sound. And, so, I don't know, just watch out for that. Let's talk about the other C clefs. So we didn't really talk about them all. And we also didn't talk about why there used to be so many clefs. But let me tell you, when you run out of room on a staff, you end up having to move notes off the staff using something called ledger lines. Like if I was going to get higher than the staff up here, I would write little lines and write my notes on them. And that's kind of a pain in the butt. And so people used to avoid ledger lines more when possible by writing music out so that most of the notes were on the staff. And in order, they would have to use a different clef that went with a instrument or vocal range. So for instance, an alto singer generally stays within this range from this note, which in an alto clef is a E, the E below middle C, all the way up to this note, which is a C, D, E, F, G, and A, the A above middle C. Most alto choir parts aren't going to get too much higher than this A, and most alto choir parts aren't going to get too much lower than this E. So it's nice and convenient. The instrument or the voice, mostly it's like effective range is represented by the staff. And it works the same. Let's go over to our Mary Had a Little Lamb over here. When we have the bass clef is still around. It's still the second most common clef probably. And it's because it really accurately contains the notes that most basses can sing. Most bass singers can get down to the bottom of the staff, this G, pretty easily. Most basses can actually go well below there to like an E or so, but that's still only like 1 or 2 lines off the staff. And again, most basses aren't going to go too much higher than this B, which would be on top of the whole staff. So bass clef still works really great for bass voices. And for instruments like a bass guitar, for instance, a bass guitar, its lowest string is only 1 line below the staff. It's an E, and its highest string is the top space of the staff, and it tends to stay within those limitations to overgeneralize. Let's get rid of that. Let's try a different clef. And now let's go into not used as often anymore clefs. We'll go with tenor clef. Tenor clef is still used, and a tenor clef, albeit, by the way, that was bass, and this is often called a treble clef. A tenor clef is a C clef, but the top line is C. So think about it. A tenor's got a lower voice than an alto, and so by moving middle C up on the staff, we open up more lines and spaces for their lower voice to sing. This makes our Mary Had a Little Lamb sounds like this. Sounds a lot different. Let's keep on going. Let's try some older clefs. So tenor, I think I mentioned this last episode. Tenor clef still gets used. No one just automatically reads in tenor clef anymore, but a lot of trombone and bassoon and cello music, when it gets way high up in the bass clef, a lot of those use bass clef. Instead of drawing a bunch of these ledger lines, it'll just use a tenor clef. So all of a sudden you're reading in tenor clef. So most classical bassoonists, trombonists, and cellists are still used to reading tenor clef, at least every once in a while. Thus ends the normal pitch clefs of today. If we were back in box time and we were going to write for a choir, we would write the bass part in bass clef, the tenor part in tenor clef, the alto part in alto clef. Guess what kind of clef we would write the soprano part in? Yeah, that's right. Let's cross this out and let's write a soprano clef. This is a soprano clef. It's a C clef on the lowest line. And if we use this and then tried to sing this Mary Had a Little Lamb notes that we had written, we would start in a, let's see, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. We would start on a B and it would sound like this. Oh, sorry, like this. Thought that seemed kind of high, even for a soprano. That actually Mary Had a Little Lamb, but not the original one. Back in our original alto clef when it was down here. But now it's up here. So it just so happens that the soprano clef made these notes still sound like Mary Had a Little Lamb, not the weird minor version or something. Who cares? There's also C clefs for all the other voice types. There's mezzo soprano C clef that's on the second line. And there's a baritone C clef that was on the top line. And a mezzo soprano is a voice that's a little lower than a soprano. And baritone is a voice that's a little lower than a tenor, like a in between our general four voices of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. There are some other clefs that were in use that aren't, and I don't want to talk about those. But there's a couple of clefs that are now in common use. So a tenor clef, not in common use, even for people who sing who are tenors. But tenor music tends to lie in a range that's not comfortable to all write in a treble clef or in a bass clef. So there's a kind of clef we call the modern tenor clef that looks like a treble clef, but has a little 8 on it. Modern tenor clef. And that just means you read it just like treble clef, except an octave lower. So when I played these notes according to the treble clef, they sounded like this. And when I play them according to the modern tenor clef, they sound like this. Those are related by an octave. So in other words, modern tenor clef takes the notes you wrote in treble clef and moves them down an octave, changes their register, but does not change class. There's a couple other clefs I just want to make sure I don't leave out. Poor percussionists. There's a whole family of musical instruments that don't have an exact pitch or have a much more complicated pitch or aren't really organized by pitch the same way that our melodic instruments are. And those are percussion instruments, but guess what? They get a clef too. A clef like this means percussion. Sometimes this clef will be written like this. And usually in a percussion clef, there's some convention where different lines and spaces just conventionally have been agreed to mean different drums. Very standard for a drum kit for the lowest space to be the bass or kick drum. Very standard in percussion notation for the third space to be the snare. And then generally a closed hi-hat, in case you were wondering, is usually an X above the top line. And so when you're notating a drum beat, you tend to see this. There's a lot of disagreement in all the drum books I've ever looked at about mean and how people distribute the various high, low, and medium tom-toms on that staff. So I won't even really talk about that. And then there's something that looks a lot like a clef, or it looks like a staff, but it isn't quite, and that's tablature. Tablature is something, if you're a guitar player, you've probably seen. In tablature, for guitar, there's 6 lines, not 5, and you'll see the word tab written like this. And in tablature, which was originally invented for lutes, which had a lot more strings, so lute tab has a lot more lines than 6, you just have each line represents one of the strings on the guitar, and you write numbers, like numbers that show you what frets to play on the guitar. So you could like chord, like you could play the 9th fret on all 3 of those strings or something. And that's kind of like a clef, but not really. And that's it. Like I said, I could probably even do another episode on clefs, but I just wanted to tell you why they exist, which is to put an instrument or voice's range all on the staff instead of off the staff, and to make sure I went through and told you about all the old clefs, and then just reassure you today the ones we still use is basically your treble clef, your bass clef, and if you're a violist, alto. Okay, bye.